getting further along that track with every passing day.
Every passing day, every passing episode, you should download, rate, subscribe to the 415ers podcast, because that is Marc Grandi. I'm Evan Giddings. We come at you twice a week here in the off season on the Odyssey Sports Podcast Network. And one thing I want to talk about now, Marc, is the fact that, well, we don't really get a whole lot of ownership news generally, especially in the off season, unless it's kind of around the draft. We've heard from John Lynch, from Kyle Shanahan, but this has kind of been the first time in recent memory that we've heard from Jed York here in the offseason, who was, speaking at the NFL annual meeting, was doing his kind of press tour, so to speak, and was asked specifically about, I think the question was about how they got Hargrave in the first place. And essentially, Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch went to Jed York and was like, hey, we have a chance to make a splash in free agency. We need some more money. And Jed York said, I'm willing to pay. Now, this isn't something that I believe he said that the 49ers can continue to do. But if you're in win now mode, which the 49ers are, he doesn't mind taking that to, the rest of his financial confidants and trying to figure out how they can work this money to add a quote unquote game changer. That is who he wanted. And Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch said, hey, there's this 305-pound 30-year-old lineman from Philadelphia who's one of the best at his position in the league, arguably a top 5 member of this free agency class. We can get him. And so Jed York said, all right, I'm willing to spend. And then through this conversation, the quote that kind of came out from that was essentially, I'm willing to spend whatever it takes to win. If that means spending $1 million on, player travel, or making sure that they have an ability to get better rest and recover more, and it costs, the figure was $1 million for a game. He is willing to spend that, Marc. And so I thought that was kind of interesting, especially in a time where we're sort of hearing owners maybe not wanting a certain quarterback named Lamar Jackson to get a fully guaranteed deal because they're trying to look after their coffers and they don't want to set a precedent about spending a lot of money in the future. It was kind of nice to hear an owner, and the one being in San Francisco, talk about money not necessarily being the end-all, be-all when it comes to winning football games.
Yeah, I think with this conversation, he was talking about, it seems to me like when they have multiple games out east and they stay out east, they don't travel back. The decision is, from the performance staff, from the training staff, Kyle Shanahan, everyone is, hey, it would be better for our players to stay out east, not travel back through multiple time zones, only to travel back out east for the following week. So then, the front office goes up to Jed York and say, hey, are you willing to put us up wherever for an extra week? It's a lot of money to house an entire football team, all of the players, all of the coaches, all of the performance staff, all of that is a ton of people. And of course, it's a professional football team. You're not going to stay at a Motel 6 in the middle of nowhere. You're staying at an expensive place. So it gets pricey quick. Remember last year, early in the season, between the games against Carolina and Atlanta, they stayed at the Greenbrier in West Virginia. That's a very famous, and I don't know what the prices are, but I'm sure very expensive, almost resort out there in West Virginia. And the Niners have done that multiple times in the last few years. That might cost you $1 million. They stayed at, Youngstown, Ohio, which I'm sure isn't nearly as expensive as the Greenbrier, but that's the, York's hometown in Ohio. And they've done that multiple times on long trips out east. So I think that's where this conversation came from. And it's kind of interesting because it eventually morphed into, well, how much would you be willing to spend every game if it guaranteed you a win? And he said, what? I'd be happy to spend $1 million a win if that's what it came to. But yeah, I'm with you. This is an interesting conversation because you don't really get the direct, money to win conversation. Obviously, there's generally, you would think, a correlation when it comes to, players' contracts and their talent level and how that translates to on the field. Generally, you spend more money, you're probably going to win more games and have a better product out there. But it does seem like Jed York has had quite a, character turnaround over the last handful of years. He does seem to be on the track of improving his standing within his own fan base.
Yeah, and I want to bounce off of that because I think there's 2 points from there that I think are should be highlighted. And that's number one, when Jed York became involved in this organization, in his late 20s, early 30s, he's still a young man, he's still growing. And honestly, the first few years then afterwards, in which he took over as CEO, wasn't necessarily well
No.
liked by the fan base because of his actions, because of maybe some misunderstandings, and all of the blowback that he got felt understandable from a fan perspective. Now it does appear that he's not just doing it because he wants to gain favor with his players and his fans, although that is important. It does feel like he has a legitimate understanding of, okay, here is where I need to get aggressive. Here's where we need to spend money, and here's where we also need to be fiscally responsible. And he's in his early 40s. I think just through experience, he's gained a better understanding of that. And to me, it, like you said, it does signal a bit of a character change for York. And I think it's also a reason why the team has been relatively successful in the last 6 years. So that's one part. The second part concerning Jed, I think is, look, it does also play into, as we talked about, the end of season player grades that
Mm.
were taken from the NFL from all players. And the 49ers scored very well in the majority of those categories. There were a lot of A's when it comes to travel arrangements, when it comes to helping out players' families, when it comes to, accommodations. And I think that now, as we're hearing Jed York talk about his willingness to spend in those specific areas, kind of and add, like an affirmation of that. And I don't think that's a coincidence between seeing those grades in which the 49ers players gave great praise to their own staff. And I think everything except for maybe the training room was an A, to where Jed York now is talking about being willing to spend $1 million on travel and making sure his players are getting right. I don't think those two things are a coincidence.
Well, as I was continuing to think about this, I think you're spot on there. The other example of Jed York and the 49ers being willing to dish out more cash to maybe help his team get ready for a game was the Monday night game in Mexico City. Remember, the Niners traveled to Colorado Springs
Yep.
to
Yeah.
to
For the
prepare,
elevation.
yeah, to prepare for the altitude. And obviously it was kind of a terrible experience for the 49ers because it was just bone chillingly cold, and they didn't really get to practice outside all that much. So maybe it wasn't the best investment, although it ended up working out because the
I was gonna
Niners
say they had maybe their
dominated
best performance
that
top to
that
bottom
Monday
of the
night game.
season.
But then you get to the comparison game. Remember what the Cardinals did leading up to that game?
Mm.
They practiced in Arizona. They did not go anywhere. They stayed in their home practice facility. I'm not saying that was the difference in a win or a loss. The Niners are probably winning that game regardless, especially looking at it afterwards, given how much they dominated. But I mean, there are owners throughout the league, and I'm not trying to disparage the Cardinals. I'm not naming any specific names, but there are owners throughout the league, Evan, who probably were faced with the decision that the Niners and the Cardinals had, and at least a handful of them would be not willing to say, yeah, we'll move a whole team out to Colorado Springs for 5 days in preparation for this game to get ready. They would just not be willing to bear that expense. And at the very least, I guess you have to credit Jed York for doing that. And you understand why. I mean, he's trying to protect his investment. He's the owner of this team. And while it can get pretty expensive pretty quick, he obviously can afford it. And number two, the better your team does, the better your investment in the team becomes. And if you feel like it's going to give your team a competitive advantage, why not do it? So I guess a long way of saying I think Jed York does deserve a little bit of credit for seemingly being willing to you know put up a decent amount of cash to maybe give his team some kind of advantage on a number of games throughout a year.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, if it turns into W's, to you know spoils. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm butchering this, but you know what I'm saying, Mark. Um, everyone that is in charge of a certain operation that succeeds gets the credit. And right
Mhm.
now, Jed York has been at the helm and has been the CEO for a team that has made the NFC title game or further 3 of the last 4 years. So
Yeah,
I think
and
he gets to take a victory lap.
you're right, he does. And I mean, remember what year was it? Like 2015 when they split up with Harbaugh? I mean, he was like the public face of that fiasco. Like the conclusion was Jed York just didn't get along with Jim Harbaugh. There was obviously pushback both ways, and Jed York said, "All right, fine, get away from my team. You're not the head coach anymore." And then of course what followed. I mean, Chip Kelly and Jim Tomsula and just
Mhm.
terrible teams for a number of years. He had to deal with being the face for the reason why the Niners had such a quick fall from grace, and he was like public enemy number one among the fan base. I mean, I don't remember exactly what season it was, um, but there were what like some fan paid a, a a plane to fly around with a banner like "Get Jed York, get the Yorks out of the 49ers." Like that was an actual thing that happened. So the fact that we're getting to a point where we can have these kinds of conversations about Jed York, um, I don't know, leading the franchise in a positive way, it just does signal how far that he has come and the lessons I think that he's learned over the years.
Yeah, and apologies for my George Bush moment. To the winner goes the spoils. That's that's the old adage. Good lord. And on that note, that will wrap things up for this episode of the 415ers podcast. That's Marc Grandi. I'm Evan Giddings. Please download, rate, subscribe. 5 stars are appreciated. Wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Google Play, all the rest. We appreciate you tuning in. And we'll be back with a Thursday episode. So we appreciate you, and we'll talk to you next time.